Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to our Educational Needs webinar this evening. I know that this event has been hugely anticipated by many of our parents and carers, and indeed our colleagues in our multidisciplinary teams, and it's lovely to have so many of you listening live this evening. For those of you who haven't seen me on screen or haven't heard me before, my name is Carmel Gallagher and I am the Paediatric Client Liaison Manager here at Irwin Mitchell, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome James Betts on the webinar this evening. And James is one of our associate solicitors with an absolute mine of information and knowledge about everything to do with EHCPs. So this is the last in our mini-series, which has been running throughout the summer and has been focusing on medical and therapy support needs for children with SEND at home during the COVID pandemic and beyond. And as you can see there, we've covered a huge array of topics throughout the series. All of those recordings are still available. And there will be some information coming out to you in the post-event emails, which will tell you how you can access that information. So before we get started this evening, just a little bit of housekeeping. There will be the opportunity for you to ask questions, and we would really encourage you to do so. Obviously, because of time constraints, we might not get through everything, but don't worry, if we aren't able to answer your query live, we will be able to respond to you after the event, and that will be either via email or telephone contact from James, myself, or one of the team. Second thing that I wanted just to say is that obviously this is the end of this series, but have no fear, there will be other paediatric specialist activities throughout the autumn and winter months, and there will be further information on those events popping into your inbox over the next few weeks, so keep an eye out for those as well. Before we go into the main content of tonight's webinar, I did just want to make a quick reference to the Panorama programme that aired on Monday night of this week on BBC. I know that there will be many of you who watched that either as it went on or via iPlayer, and it covered a lot of quite distressing but unfortunately familiar themes that will have resonated with many of the families that we work with and many of you listening tonight. We aren't going to be making any particular comments in regard to that Panorama programme, but I did think that it was timely that that had aired in the same week that we were presenting this. So on with the presentation this evening. I wanted to ensure that we included something around educational psychology and its role within the EHCP process, and James is going to go into a lot more detail about EHCPs in his part of the presentation. But I wanted to start this evening by just having a quick review of the definition of what education psychology is and where it fits in. And for me, the key points from the description that you have on your screen right now is that it's not just about the child. Yes, of course, they are central to the process and central to the work, but it's also about families and schools. And it's not just about promoting education and academic achievements, but it has a much broader scope and needs to think about the emotional and social well-being of young people. Next slide, please. I also thought it was useful to do just a little bit of myth busting, because when we think about educational psychology, often it can be quite a confusing area. And I know that in my years of experience, there are a number of common misconceptions that raise with families. So first one, yes, it's true that EPs, and I'm going to use that acronym, otherwise I shall end up tied up in knots by the end of the presentation. So EPs, educational psychologists, do carry out cognitive tests and IQ tests, but they only do that if they are the least intrusive way of gathering information. In other words, they will look at all of the other wealth of information that is available to them about a child, rather than using those tests. It's also true that they work alongside other services, and they're looking to achieve better outcomes for children and young people, and that is best achieved when they work as part of a multidisciplinary team. EPs cannot diagnose medical conditions. They're not qualified to do so. Also, they're more focused and more interested on addressing the needs of that child, regardless of any diagnosis or label that may be attached to a particular condition. EPs can provide an emergency, EPs can't provide an emergency service, but they can respond in crisis situations. And again, that is part of their work as part of the multidisciplinary teams. And the final falsehood is that just because an EP has been involved or has produced a report for a child, it does not guarantee access to resources, equipment or provision in an education setting. Next slide, please. So I thought it was important just to think about that EP role as being quite holistic in its approach. It's focused on the learner or the pupil, but it needs to take into consideration learning experiences. It needs to think about the learning processes and what support might be needed to enable those to happen most successfully. It needs to involve the teacher. No EP input is going to work or be effective if the teacher is not central to that process. And finally, it needs to think about the learning situation and the environment in which that child is operating. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before that EPs do have a role within the EHCP process, and they can carry out needs assessments as part of that application. To do so, they are commissioned by the local authorities to be educational psychology advice givers, and that's part of the local authority's statutory duty of care as set out in the SEND Code of Practice, and I know that James will refer back to that later in his presentation. Good, sound EP advice should promote co-production with parent carers and other agencies. In other words, everybody who needs to be involved and consulted with should be part of that report, part of that assessment process. Their advice must comply with the requirements of the SEND legislation, and it also must meet the EP professional standards and guidelines. Next slide, please. So to think about practical examples of how an EP's advice might be used in a school setting, I've broken this down into teaching and learning context and also in terms of the curriculum. So an EP advice will make suggestions around different methods that can be used to enhance the teaching and learning process. In other words, what can be done to achieve better results. Their advice should give emphasis to how to motivate and enable a child to become more ready and better engaged within the classroom environment. And the focus should be on emphasising activity-based teaching. In other words, that the child is actively involved in the process of learning. They're not being done to. It's a collaborative approach. And in terms of the curriculum, this is where their work with teachers becomes an integral part of the process, because the EP will be working closely with the class teacher and any teaching assistants or other support staff to prepare the curriculum according to the needs of the student. They should be looking at basing that on an easy to difficult approach, which enables differentiation and graded progress. Their advice will stress individual differences, and therefore the curriculum should also be flexible for every learner in the classroom. And this last point has become even more important over the last 6 months, that the use of audio visual aids as part and parcel of that teaching and learning process should be as widely encouraged as possible. Next slide, please. I know that I've heard from lots of parents and carers over the last few months that there is huge anxiety, both from parents and from children, about reintegrating and returning to the school setting. And that in turn has led to increased demands on EPs. But it's important to recognise the difference. Many children will be finding it challenging to return to school, and this will include children who previously may not have been on an SEN register or have been known to the SEN department within school or have an EHCP in place. That's not to say that their needs and concerns aren't important, but it's a different group of learners. And because of that, EPs and SENCOs are currently working to develop a range of strategies that help to address those emotional and social wellbeing needs directly related to the pandemic. And some parents on the webinar this evening may already be familiar with some of those strategies and have seen them in place and working as children have returned to school over last week and this week. So they will include things like social stories and using those to help prepare children to return to the classroom. Much more information being shared between home and school, and one-to-one, small group and whole class activities to address common anxieties and common issues that children are raising in response to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So that is it from me for now. I will be joining you again at the end of the presentation, where James and I will be fielding your questions. Please do use the Q&A function to raise questions throughout. You will have also had a little reminder pop up on your screens to submit your feedback at the end of this evening's presentation as well. But for now, goodbye from me, and I will hand over to James. James, good evening and welcome.
Thanks, Carmel. Evening, everyone. Thank you for that. So I'm James. I'm a solicitor in the Public Law Department. I specialise mainly in education law, and most of that work is to do with EHCPs, helping people get an EHCP, get the assessments in the first place, and then making sure they're good ones, and kind of disputes around school places and things like that. So I'm conscious that we've only got a short amount of time, but if we can move on to the next slide, please. What we'll be looking at today is essentially the law governing education and healthcare plans and what the process is, what one should look like, what the potential disputes might be, how you can then sort those out, kind of what are your options, and with the coronavirus situation at the moment, I thought it'd also be useful to look at kind of what the implications of the virus have been and how that has changed some bits of the law. So the main act in relation to EHCPs is the Children and Families Act. That was brought in 2014 and replaced statements which we had before. So we had a few years where local authorities were converting all their statements to education and healthcare plans, but that should all be done now. There's regulations that go with the Act, and those regulations set out more detail regarding kind of the process. And then there's the Code of Practice, which is really good, quite easy to read. It's long, but it's written in an easy to read format, and is a really good starting point if you've ever got a SEND related question. And then the Education Act still contains some relevance as well. So, for example, when a child's out of school, the Education Act places local authorities under a duty to provide suitable education. So that's still relevant as well. So I think it's important, firstly, to look at what the general duty is. So in relation to children with special educational needs and those that have an education and healthcare plan, it's the local authority that are under an obligation to provide support. And case law, it's well established, has confirmed that local authorities aren't under an obligation to show that they're not under an obligation to provide the best possible education for a child, but they do need to provide what's reasonably required. So often, and as we'll see, that there can be disputes about what provisions should be provided or what school somebody should attend, and in those situations what you need to show isn't just that kind of what you are seeking is better, but rather that it's what is required. So I think that's just a good thing to always bear in mind. You need to show what is reasonably required. And I also thought it'd be just quite useful to look at the definitions of special educational needs that are in the Act. So this is lifted from the Children and Families Act, and it says that a learning difficulty, so it talks about a learning difficulty, which calls for special educational provision to be made, will be a learning difficulty if a child has significant greater difficulty learning than the majority of children their age, or if they have a disability which prevents them from making use of the kind of facilities generally provided for children of the same age in a mainstream school. So I think the important point there is it's a wide definition. So, for example, it can include, it talks about if a person has a disability that prevents them from accessing a normal kind of mainstream setting. So that could include, for example, I've had clients where they might be very bright, so on for straight A's at GCSE, or the numbers now, aren't they? But maybe because of a particular mental health problem, PTSD, for example, they might not be able to access kind of a large mainstream high school. That might be too big an environment for them, and in that situation, they would fall into this definition. So you don't, even though kind of cognitively and grades wise they might be kind of working at a very high level. So it's a wide definition, and the question is does that person have a disability that prevents them from accessing those types of facilities? So that it's a wide definition. And then in terms of special educational provision, the Act defines it as the same thing, really. It basically says that special educational provision is anything over and above that which would usually be provided to children of the same age. So I think what we'll be looking at today is, firstly, does a child have an EHCP? If not, it's always worth asking, should they have one? And we'll look at the criteria for that. It's often a lot lower than local authorities would have you believe. We'll look at the benefits to having an EHCP, which very briefly, I would say an EHCP is a legal document. So once you have an EHCP, it places local authorities and CCGs under legal duty to deliver what's in the plan. Whereas without an EHCP, you could be getting lots of good support, and then for whatever reason that stops. So say, for example, the funding gets cut, and without an EHCP, you won't have any recourse. Another benefit is, if done properly, the assessment itself should be a really useful way of finding out more information about what a child's needs are and what what might need to be put in place to help them. And finally, as we've just talked about, for certain provision you need an education and healthcare plan. You won't be able to get it without one. So for example, a special school placement, that isn't going to happen realistically without an education and healthcare plan. The majority of the time you'll also need an education and healthcare plan for if you think a full-time TA is needed, or if you're looking for kind of regular speech or occupational therapy or something like that. And finally, the other major benefit is that once you have an EHCP, if you're having an argument with the school or the local authority about what is needed, you're hitting a brick wall, no one's listening to you, or they're just adamant they're not going to provide it. Once you've got an EHCP, you can go to the tribunal and ask them to make changes to order the local authority to provide whatever it is you want, be that more support or a different school. And that's a major thing. You don't have that without an EHCP. Without one, kind of, you ask, they say no, and there isn't really anything that you can massively do. So they are really important. Without an education and healthcare plan, local authorities still have to provide suitable education, and schools are still bound by the Equality Act and, for example, have to make reasonable adjustments for children that have a disability. So there are still duties there without an EHCP, but nothing with the same level of kind of legal force. So that's why having an EHCP is so important if you feel that your child does need more support than would usually be provided. So if we quickly move on, what we'll look at now is what the process is for getting an education and healthcare plan. And I am conscious of time, so sorry if I am kind of racing through this. But the first thing that has to happen, if you haven't got if your child hasn't got an EHCP and you think one is needed, is somebody needs to make a request to the local authority that they carry out a formal education and healthcare plan needs assessment. Now, that request can come from the school. That's good if they're happy to make it, or the college if they're in college. It can also be made by parents themselves. Often parents don't necessarily realise that, and you don't have to wait for the school to do that. And what I find from my experience is that schools are often a bit overly conservative, I would say, about when to make these requests. And one of the reasons is that schools get a lot of their information from local authorities, and local authorities will often set the bar for assessment much higher than it is legally. So the bit in the slide here, section 36A of the Children and Families Act, this sets out when a local authority should carry out an assessment. And it says they must assess if a child may have SEN, and it may be necessary for SEN provision to be made for that child in accordance with an EHCP. And the important word there in both bits, I've missed it out actually on the first bullet point, but the important word is you only need to show that your child may have SEN and that they might need more help than can be provided without an EHCP. You don't have to show at this stage when you're making that request that they definitely have SEN or they definitely need more help. It's just that they may, and that's a low threshold. Now local authorities will often and that's all the law says about that. That's the only test. But what you'll find is that local authorities will often kind of have policies, often informal policies, because they're often not kind of silly enough to put these things in writing. But they'll often have policies where they say we're only going to do an assessment if, for example, a child's have been seen by an educational psychologist twice already, or if we think that they're going to need more than £6,000 worth of support, or if they have this particular diagnosis, or if the school have already supported them for 2 terms, or all of these things you hear you learn new ones every day that different local authorities are doing. And none of these are set out in law. And so what you'll find is the schools will be getting that information, who will be saying that. And so they'll say, well, we don't think the local authority will agree if we make this request now. And so they'll want to often hold off. And they've got the same desire to get extra help, but they don't necessarily know that kind of the local authority is giving them the wrong information. Now, in practice, what will happen is you will make this request, and I'm telling you there's a low threshold. In practice, local authorities will often then refuse that and apply that higher threshold that we talked about and those kind of policies that are often unlawful. At that point, you will get a right of appeal against that decision. And in the vast majority of cases, if you do appeal, and this is to the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal, local authorities will very often then change their mind prior to a hearing. And just to give you an idea, I've been doing this work for kind of 10 years now plus, and I've never even had an appeal against the refusal to assess get to a final hearing stage, because usually once you register an appeal, local authorities will often then just kind of agree to do it, and they'll find some reason to explain that. So this has changed, the school now said this, but usually they're gambling on the fact that a lot of parents won't bother appealing, and that's an easy way for them to kind of not have to issue these plans that kind of cost money and takes time. So in terms of these slides, the key thing is it's a low threshold. You can make the request yourself as a parent, and once you make that request, legally the local authority have to get back to you within 6 weeks to let you know whether or not they're going to carry out an assessment. And if they don't carry out the assessment, you get a right of appeal. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm conscious of time. These are some things that in the code of practice sets out that there are things that should be considered when you make this request. They're not things that you have to show, but they're considerations. I think the key takeaway point here is that when you're making this request, what you want to say, even if you don't necessarily think this, and you might think that maybe the school could have done more, you might think the school's been brilliant. Either way, what you want to say, you don't want to blame the school when you're making this request, because what you want to say is that my child may have special educational needs, and these are all the reports and things and the evidence as to why that's the case. Everyone's been doing their best to put things in place to kind of meet the needs at school, but despite that, there are still these problems, and that might be academic, it might be social skills, it might be physical needs, it might be a whole raft of different things, but there are still some problems that aren't being sorted. The needs aren't being fully met, and therefore we now think that there's a need for an organised assessment to look at kind of whether anything else is needed. So that's how you phrase that request. If you criticise the school when you make that, then the local authority will often say, well, actually, we agree with you. We think the school should do X, Y, and Z first before we agree to assess. So it's always better to try and work together with the school and present it as with both. Everyone's been doing their best, and now we need more help, local authority, and we need this to be looked into. So that request is made to the local authority's special educational needs team. So if we can move on. So thank you, Natasha. So what we want is, first hurdle is to get the local authority to agree to assess. If they agree to assess, essentially what an assessment process is a process which is coordinated by the local authority, whereby they arrange to gather lots of information from different people to get more information about the child or young person's needs. So that would include information from parents, more information from the school, information from an educational psychologist, always, information from a healthcare professional, information from social care. And I would say usually that should lead to social care doing an assessment themselves. Often that doesn't happen, but in theory it should. And also anyone else the local authority or parents consider is appropriate, or the parents reasonably request. And that places the local authority under a duty when they're doing these assessments to think about, okay, we're getting information from an educational psychologist, but is there anyone else we need to get information from? And that should lead them to think, for example, do we need to get speech therapy information if this child has social communication needs or speech needs? It should get them to think, do we need to get occupational therapy advice if this child has physical needs or sensory needs? Same with physio. And parents can also request if there's anyone involved that parents reasonably request they get information from, then they should be doing that too. So the assessment process is the local authority getting all of this information from these different people, and that's set out in the regulation there. So now all of that evidence, and this is something that often local authorities will fall down on, and we'll come on to why it's so important, but the advice that they get should be clear, accessible and specific. So it should clearly set out what each expert that's feeding into that assessment thinks that child needs. And the code of practice says there that local authorities shouldn't have any blanket policies that prevent experts from commenting on the amount of provision they consider is needed. Now that again doesn't always happen in practice, I think, and that's why you get a lot of problems. But it's there in black and white in the code of practice. So if we can move on. Thank you, Natasha. So at the end of that assessment process, they get all of that information and they have to decide whether or not to issue a plan. And essentially the question is, okay, we've got all of this information. Does this child need more help than can be provided without an EHC plan? So basically, do they need more help than is available from within your average mainstream school? And again, this should give you a formal decision in relation to that. And if they refuse to issue a plan, you'll get a right of appeal. Now, from my experience, more often than not, the battle is getting them to do the assessment in the first place. Once they do an assessment, I would say usually they'll then issue a plan, not always. The problem will be then making sure that it's a good plan. But if they decide to not issue a plan, again, you'll get a right of appeal. And again, often they'll then change your mind if you do appeal. I had a case just this week where the local authority made a decision a couple of weeks ago to not assess in light of loads of evidence from the school saying this child needs full-time one-to-one, and there are all these issues. And the local authority still refused, and we wrote a letter saying we're thinking of appealing, and within a couple of days they changed their mind, and that shows you they will try and kind of get away with things sometimes. But yeah, you get another right of appeal then. So hopefully though they issue a plan. Now an education and healthcare plan, they're not easy to read documents. They're set out into kind of all of these different sections that you can see on your screen there. The key sections are sections B, F and I from an educational perspective. Now section B is the section that should set out the child's special educational needs. So that should set out all of the difficulties that your child has. Section F is then the section that sets out the special educational provision that they require. And that's the really key part of the plan, because anything that's listed in there, provided it's specified and quantified as it should be, the local authority are then under a legal duty to provide it. So if section F says this child requires full-time one-to-one support from a teaching assistant trained and experienced in autism for 32.5 hours a week, the local authority have to provide it. It's just a clear legal obligation, and you can take legal action if they don't. And then the other education section is section I, which is the bit that names the school. And then you've got other sections that include health needs, social care needs, and the provision required to meet those as well. So we can move on to the next slide. Now, it's important that section B sets the needs out properly, because unless there's a need set out in section B, you're not going to then get provision for it in section F, which is the all-important section. So, for example, if a child, for example, if you think, for example, that a child might need small class sizes, that small class sizes could be provision that we think needs to go in section F. But that might not be in there unless section B sets out why small class sizes are needed. So that might be because the child maybe struggles to cope with noise and can become very anxious in larger environments. If that's set out in section B, you've then got kind of justification for saying, well, section F now needs provision to deal with that. So they struggle in these larger groups, they can't cope with noise, they get very anxious, and therefore the plan needs to set out what we're going to do, and that could be small class sizes, for example. In a similar fashion, if section B mentions kind of receptive and expressive language difficulties, then you've then got a case to say, okay, there are these difficulties and maybe speech therapy input needs to be set out in section F. So each section links on to the next one, really. So we can move to the next slide, please. This deals with outcomes. I didn't mention outcomes. They don't have the same legal force, but they are important still. They're section E of the plan, and basically the outcomes, in some ways I think it would be better if the outcome section came after the provision section, so maybe after section F, because essentially what an outcome is what's going to be the result of the provision that's been put in place. So if, for example, speech therapy is needed, what is that speech therapy going to get you? And those outcomes should be SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and targeted. So they should be worded kind of in a specific manner. And those outcomes then should be looked at every year to look at, okay, have those outcomes been achieved? Do they need to be changed? And then the all-important section that we've talked about is section F, which I think we're going to come on to. Now, the key thing here, the key takeaway point, if you can take away any point from today, is that section should be specific and quantified and deal with every need that's in section B. And it can include things, educational provision can cover anything really. It could cover equipment, it can cover the level of training that staff need, it can cover kind of particular strategies. But the key thing I would say is anything that's going to cost extra money and is going to be bought in on top of that which is usually provided needs to be set out in here. So if, for example, so we want a good section F would set out kind of if there's going to be a need for one-to-one support, or speech therapy, or occupational therapy, or maybe a smaller class size, or a peer group of children with similar needs, or maybe there's a need for staff who have particular expertise, that needs to be in section F. And often, I would say 9 out of 10 EHCPs, probably more, kind of will often contain no specific or quantified provision. And what that means is you've gone through all that trouble and all those weeks to try and get an EHCP, and unless they provide in section F specific and quantified provision, they don't really mean anything because it doesn't place the local authority under any legal obligation. So if, for example, a plan just says this child requires some one-to-one support every now and again, or access to one-to-one support, it doesn't create any specific duty on the local authority, because access to one-to-one support could be achieved through having a teaching assistant sat at the back of the class working with another child who comes over to say hi every now and again. So it needs to be, what it should be is how many hours of one-to-one support, what level of training does that TA need, all of that needs to be in there. And then you get the benefit of the EHCP, and it creates this legal obligation. So we can move on, please. So I've kind of covered this already, but this is just a couple of cases really flagging up that one thing that any special educational needs can be anything, and the question isn't who is providing that support. The question is it educational? So often what you might see is that local authorities like putting speech therapy into the health section of a plan. And the reason they do that is because then they're not under any obligation to provide it. It falls on the CCG. But the question isn't, and they'll say it's being provided by the NHS, it's for them, it's a health thing. But it's been well established that speech therapy is educational, and so if it is educational, it should go in section F, and then it's the local authority's responsibility. And then I think we've got some better examples than that, so we'll come on to it. But yeah, so a good EHC plan. So we've got our assessment. Hopefully, we've got an EHCP issued. The plan, we want a plan that sets out all the educational needs, properly specifies provision, and clearly sets everything out. So I think I've put some examples here to take a look at on the next slide, hopefully. I think, yeah, so if we look at these examples, these are things that you might often see in an EHCP. And at first sight, they might look quite good. So if we look at number 1, the NHS Speech and Language Therapy Service will provide up to 60 minutes of speech and language therapy per week. So you might think, oh, good, that kind of sets out the amount of minutes needed. It talks about speech and language therapy service. That's good. But in actual fact, that doesn't actually provide any duty on the local authority at all, really. because one, it talks about up to 60 minutes. So it doesn't set a minimum level. So it's saying that this child can't receive any more than an hour of speech therapy, but it doesn't set out what the minimum amount is, and therefore local authority could provide kind of no support, and there wouldn't be anything there. Also, I don't like the fact it says speech and language therapy service, because that could include kind of a speech and language therapy assistant, for example, and that might be fine, but it might not. So really what I want for it to say is that it's a speech and language therapist providing that. I'd also like it to confirm, is that on a one-to-one basis or is it in a group basis? Because again, at the moment, that could be speech and language therapy in a group of 20 children, and that might not be what is needed. Again, I've not got time to go through all of these. Number 3, about this block of weekly sessions with an OT trained in sensory processing disorders. That's very good, but it doesn't. It only gives you something for the first term, and then it would. Then all of that duty to provide it would fall away. Whereas an EHCP should look at the next 12 months really. So we need it. It should just we need to look further than that. So it might be fine to say a block of weekly OT for the first term, and thereafter the OT is going to do monthly reviews or whatever it is. That would be fine, but it needs to set out something that makes sure there's an ongoing duty. So I'm just conscious of time, so we can move on to the next one, but hopefully that helps illustrate the point. So at this point, we've got our draft EHCP, local authority issues the draft, and at that point, they invite parents to request a particular school, so you can express a preference of school once they issue the draft. And legally, your local authority has to name the school that you want, that you ask for, unless the school is unsuitable, or the child's attendance at the school would be an inefficient use of resources or incompatible with the efficient education of others. So what that means essentially is that local authorities can sometimes refuse, or will sometimes refuse, because they'll say, we think that the school that you want costs too much, and we think that this school down the road can meet needs and is cheaper. Or sometimes they might, especially for local authority special schools, they might be very oversubscribed, and so they might say the school would be suitable, but there isn't space, and if the school couldn't cope with another pupil, and therefore the attendance would be incompatible with the efficient education of others. So that's the test they have to apply. And if they then name a different school because they say one of these exceptions apply, again, you can go to the tribunal and you would have to, you'd be arguing that they were wrong to apply that exception. So, for example, if you were seeking a place at an independent special school that the local authority had refused on the grounds of cost, and on the basis that their school can meet needs for less, you'd be wanting to show that their school can't meet needs and that your school is the only one that can. And once the plan is issued, the school named in the plan have to admit the child. And that's section 43 of the Act. So the final plan from start to finish, if no appeal is needed at any point, from the date you request an assessment, a local authority should be issuing a finalised plan within 20 weeks. And once that plan is finalised, that's when it has legal force. So it's only once it's finalised that all the duties to kick in. And those duties are that the local authority must secure the special educational provision, the CCG must provide any healthcare provision that's listed in section G, and then that plan should be reviewed every year. And after every annual review, you get a right of appeal. And what I should have said is once the plan is finalised, you get a right of appeal at that point. So if the plan's finalised, then you disagree with the school, or there's a disagreement about how much speech therapy is needed, or how much one-to-one, or whatever it is, you can appeal the contents of the plan and ask the tribunal to make a decision as to what's needed. And often to help you with that, if you are registering those appeals, you might want to gather further evidence from independent experts, for example, and people who know your child well, to set out what they think is needed so that you can rely on that. So that's the EHCP process very quickly. Can we move on to the next one? Thank you, Natasha. So that sets out the process in a bit of a kind of a diagram. So you request an assessment, they do the assessment, issue a plan, and then and if they refuse at any point to assess or issue a plan, or they issue a plan that doesn't set anything out or you disagree with, then you can appeal at each of those points. So, thank you. Again, conscious of time, I just wanted to quickly flag that once a child turns 16, the right of appeal becomes their right of appeal. That's a change brought in by the Act. Unless they lack capacity to make those types of decisions. If they do, then parents can still do that on their behalf. So in a lot of cases, parent can still bring an appeal for their children over if they're over 16. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And the next one, I just think we've got time to cover that. Thank you. So in terms of tribunal appeals, tribunal is a special educational needs and disability tribunal. You can appeal the contents of the educational sections, so B, F and I. You have 2 months from the date of the decision that you're challenging to register an appeal. And at the moment, a really good thing that's in force is a national trial, which enables you, if you're bringing an appeal against the educational sections, to now also appeal the health and social care sections as well, if you want to. And the tribunal can make recommendations about those sections as well now. Now, this is just a trial, but it's good because previously the tribunal could only look at the education sections, whereas now this allows them, if, for example, maybe you're in a dispute with the local authority about maybe are you entitled to respite or not, or what help might be needed at home, or a particular piece of health equipment, for example, then the tribunal can now look at those issues as well. But they have to be attached to an education appeal. You can't just appeal the health and social care sections on their own. Thanks, Natasha. So yeah, you can appeal at any point, as we've mentioned. So if they refuse to assess, you can appeal. If they refuse to issue a plan, you can appeal. You can appeal the final plan. If following an annual review, so maybe you've already got an EHCP, and the purpose of an annual review is to look at, does the plan remain accurate? Does it need to be changed? If the local authority don't do that, then again, you can appeal at that point. They should write to you to say we're not making any changes, and you can appeal. And also, kind of further down the line, if as your child's getting older, the local authority will need to consider whether or not to continue the plan. And if they decide to end the plan, then again, you'll get a right of appeal against that decision. Thanks, Natasha. So the tribunal is where you go if there's a dispute about what the plan says. So if there's a dispute about the school named, or what your child's needs are, or what provision is needed, the tribunal is the way of getting that sorted. If anything else happens where the local authority are acting unlawfully, then there's a remedy called judicial review, where you can bring or threaten action to the High Court. Often these issues are sorted very quickly through letters. But so, for example, if you've already got a good plan that says, for example, speech therapy needs to be provided and it isn't, then judicial review would be the remedy there. If the local authority aren't complying with the timescales for issuing an EHCP, judicial review is a potential remedy. If, for example, there's a dispute about home to school transport, or maybe your child isn't able to attend school but they're not getting any education, all of these things, and I list them there, are potentially challengeable by way of judicial review. Now, judicial review sounds kind of scary, it's to the High Court, but again, 9 times out of 10, most of these issues will resolve through a letter, a legal letter to say, look, you should be doing this because the law says you have to. Unless you do it, then we're going to take legal action, and usually, more often than not, that will resolve it. The other place that you can potentially go is the local government ombudsman. Local government ombudsman can look at complaints about kind of local authority failures. And for judicial review, I should have mentioned legal aid is available in the child's name. So for tribunal appeals, it's the parents' means that are assessed for legal aid purposes, because until your child's 16, it's your right of appeal as a parent to bring an appeal, so it's your means that are assessed. But for legal aid, the duties are owed to the, so for judicial review, sorry, the duties are owed to the child, and so it's their means that would be assessed, and so most children will be eligible for legal aid. Thanks, Natasha. And the other thing I should have, actually I'm going to come on to that, so quick whiz through. So in terms of COVID-19, the main changes are obviously schools are open now. The government has confirmed that they expect everyone to be in school unless there's a clinical reason. So if you don't think it's safe for your child to attend school, then really you need some written evidence from a doctor or someone to say that. Can we move on to the next one? Thank you. Schools should be considering doing individual risk assessments for children with special educational needs to look at kind of how they're going to go, what help they might need. And we can move on to the next slide, please, Natasha, just at the time. The government have announced some catch-up support. So in special schools, for example, every child will get an extra £240. And that money can be spent on things like speech therapy, educational psychology input. It's the school's decision, but they should be kind of speaking to you about that. So it might be worth speaking to your school about how they're going to use that funding. Next slide, please, Natasha. Just conscious of having a need for questions. So you might have heard during coronavirus that there was some changes where EHCPs didn't have the same legal force. There was a watering down of the duties to give local authorities a bit of flexibility. That's ended now. EHCPs are back in force in full, so anything in the plan has to be provided again now, as it was prior to coronavirus. What measures are in place to protect children? Do they need to wear face masks? There's no requirement for face masks or temperature checks. Schools should be doing their own risk assessments, but yeah, there isn't any legal requirement on that. If you're concerned about what measures are in place, ask to see the school's risk assessment. If we can move on to the next one, please, Natasha. And again, apologies for the speed. And then if we can go on, because I think we've covered that about face masks already. And again, with the EHCPs, there was another change whereby during the coronavirus situation, the government relaxed the timescales for completion. So I talked about there being 6 weeks to consider your initial request for assessment and 20 weeks for issuing a final plan. Those have been amended, those timescales, to give local authorities a bit of flexibility if they've not been able to complete them because of a COVID-related reason, so maybe experts being unavailable. That change ends on the 25th of September, and then all the timescales will revert back. Thanks, Natasha. So I think key thing, hopefully, takeaway point is the law is there. Be prepared to use it. I've talked briefly already about the options, but we'll just summarise them now, if that's all right. So if we can carry on, please. So SEN tribunal is where you bring any dispute about an EHCP. That same tribunal also hear discrimination cases, which are brought against the school. Although I would say more often than not, even if you think the school may have been discriminatory, if you're concerned about the provision that your child needs, often getting the EHCP sorted is going to be the better way of sorting it out. And do appeal if you are concerned. Just giving them some stats there that set out that how many cases are decided in favour of parents. 2018 to 2019, 92% of cases resulted in being decided in the favour of parents. Now that might not be that parents are getting everything they want, but that will include cases where local authorities are ordered to make some changes to the plan. Maybe not everything the parent wants, but yeah, you'll usually always get improvements through appealing the plan. And legal aid is available for special educational needs cases and for tribunal appeals for people that are eligible. If you want to take advantage of legal aid, you need to follow that link that I've put there in the slide, and there's a kind of, you have to go to the central triage service. So do appeal. Other options, I've talked about judicial review. That's for anything else essentially, and usually what I'd say is if something seems wrong, it often will be. So yeah, those are some examples of cases where you might want to bring a judicial review. Do act quickly if you think that there might be a judicial review. Get advice quickly because there are strict time limits. And finally, the other option is the local government ombudsman. The local government ombudsman is probably better to resolve kind of historic disputes. So I would often say get the EHCP sorted, but then if you think that the local authority have acted really badly in the run up to all that, then the LGO can investigate that, and they can kind of recommend compensation and things like that. And again, there are some examples there of things that the Ombudsman have done. So if we can move on, please, Natasha. And again, those are just some examples of things the Ombudsman can order. So I think just kind of know your rights. Hopefully now through that, you know a bit more about the process. You can spot when maybe the local authority aren't doing what they should, and be prepared to challenge things if you feel there is something wrong. Get advice if you can. Yeah, usually if something feels wrong, it will be. So we can move on to the next one. So we can help at any stage. We can help with tribunal appeals, but we can help before that in preparing for annual reviews or requesting assessments for EHCPs. Yeah, and we can do judicial review and things like that. So yeah, at any point we can help with these things. Thanks, Natasha. So I think before we go on to questions, I just wanted to flag up that we've got a new Facebook group for parent carers. That was set up, I think, just a few months ago, and it's already got a lot of activity on in there. There's a competition running throughout September where you can win, I think it's vouchers. It's a drawing competition essentially. So do have a look at that, and we keep all our information about future webinars, resources and things are all posted on there. We've also got our website that is has a lot of resources on it as well. So for example, there are fact sheets about EHCPs on there that are really useful. And I'm conscious we've not got much time for questions. I'll take a couple if we can, and then again, if you don't have time to get your question answered, do go onto the Facebook group and we can put it on there and we'll follow up on it, because kind of the solicitors do input into that. So have we got any questions at all?
Hi James, it's Carl again. Thank you so much. I can't believe you've managed to through so much information so quickly. And just to reassure people, obviously when the recordings are sent out, you'll have plenty of time to go over that content at your leisure, so that you can review the key points that you want to look at. I think my camera has gone off, so apologies if you can't see me just yet. I just wanted to reflect back on a couple of the points that you raised, and thinking about my own experience over the years. And I think for me, a couple of the things I wanted to draw on is that when you do have an EHCP in place, section B and section F must tally. You must be able to see the connection between the two, and as a parent carer, you should recognise your own child within the report. If it doesn't read like your child, if it doesn't sound like your child, the likelihood is it isn't your child and it's not going to meet their needs. So I think having that opportunity to review and to keep coming back to the EHCP document in that time frame is really important. Another thing that I wanted to just to reflect on is an observation really, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, James. That very often I've found that schools tend to focus on section E, the outcomes, and I think that's probably because schools are measured on outcomes. I don't know whether you had a comment on that.
Yeah, obviously outcomes in some ways become more important from a legal perspective as a child gets older, because often then local authorities will look at those when deciding whether or not to end the plan, for example, or if a child's making kind of progress. You can't formally appeal the outcomes. You can only appeal sections B and F and the school as well. So I wouldn't get necessarily bogged down by them. Yes, they need to be right and they should be specific and measurable and smart and all of that. But the main thing really is, the key thing is making sure that the needs section is right and that the provision is properly specified in section F. And yeah, I think it'd be much better if the outcome section came after the provision section, because really what the outcome should be is telling you what is this provision going to get you, essentially. So, for example, what's the one-to-one support going to get?
Yeah, Absolutely. So just reviewing the questions that have come in as we've been live, a relatively quick question. If somebody has an EHCP in place in one area of the country, but they want to move, will their EHCP move with them?
It depends. If you move in within the same local authority, then no change. Your EHCP is your EHCP. If you move to a different local authority, then essentially the duty then transfers to that new local authority, and there are timescales then for that local authority to kind of basically do a reassessment or a review and issue their own plan. In the meantime, they'll be having to follow the last plan, but sometimes that might not always be possible. If, for example, you're moving from London to Manchester, your London EHCP might name a school and it might be too far to travel. So in that situation, the local authority would have to put in kind of arrange for a different school to be to attend, but whilst they kind of convert the plan over. So yeah, there's no guarantees. Essentially, you could have a really good EHCP in one local authority, and then when it moves over to when you move to the new one, essentially the new local authority can rewrite it, albeit that any changes should be evidence based.
That's great. Thank you for that, James. And apologies to everybody listening and watching. My camera, for some reason, has gone black, so you can't see me, but hopefully you can still hear me. There was a question that came through with regard to sensory needs and being told that they shouldn't be included in reports because the borough doesn't kind of acknowledge or recognise sensory needs. I just wanted to pick up on that because actually it was something that Shelley Williams covered in one of our earlier webinars, and I think the most important information that I can feed back on that matter is that whilst sensory needs and sensory profiling and assessment may have different weight and different interpretation across the country, what can't be disputed is the impact that sensory needs have on occupation and on function. And I think if reports are written in a way that emphasises those two key issues, then clearly, thinking back to the information that James has given us before, you know, thinking about Section B and Section F, you can clearly relate those then to those two areas within an EHCP plan.
Yeah, it's a big issue, sensory needs. Often, and it's harder to. Usually, it's only put in place when things have really gone badly. So I've, for example, seen lots of cases where maybe a child with autism, things have been going all right, but maybe just getting worse and worse, and to the point where they're maybe 14, 15, and the school placement's broken down. And they've never had any occupational therapy input often, or certainly no occupational therapy input from someone trained in sensory needs. And so the sensory needs aren't set out in the plan, and they're just not being met. There's no plan for that, and so and that can have a major impact. And partly it's because there isn't the same amount of OTs with sensory experience, I don't think, as there are, for example, speech therapists, but it is often the bigger fight. If you apply the law, then if you think about it, what we talked about, when the local authority does that EHC assessment in the first place, they should be considering, does this child have any particular needs where we need to get extra information? And if parents reasonably request an occupational therapy assessment to consider that, then they should be getting one, and that report should then be specific and make recommendations. Now in practice that doesn't happen, so if it doesn't, I guess your options are appealing and trying to get evidence yourself from an OT about what's needed and asking the tribunal to then order that. Also, if you've got you mentioned that local authorities might sometimes have a policy where they don't recognise sensory needs. That's the type of thing. Any policy like that where there's a set rule for no reason, which doesn't reflect the law, that type of thing might be challengeable by way of judicial review as well to get the policy itself changed. So yeah, there are a few different ways of dealing with it, but yeah, ultimately appeal, try and get it in the plan, get evidence. Get evidence from an OT if you can, and ask the tribunal to put it in the plan.
Thanks, James. I think we've got probably, I know we're slightly over time, but one final question that came through quite early on, and that was with regard to an EHCP assessment that had been refused on the grounds that the school placement hadn't previously implemented the recommendations of healthcare professionals' reports. And how do the parents now kind of respond to and appeal that decision?
I guess the question is okay, the placement's broken down, and so what do we want to happen moving forwards? I think the key thing there is to make sure that all of those considerations and that process is done by way of a formal annual review of the EHCP, because otherwise, so say for example the school placement breaks down, you need to make sure that it's a formal annual review, because that way, if then you disagree with the outcome, you'll get a right of appeal. Whereas,
yeah, and sorry, James, just to interrupt. So in this case, there isn't an EHCP.
Right.
That was refused.
Right.
And the detail that's come through in the question is that the local authority refused the assessment because schools hadn't put in place the recommendations.
Right. Okay, sorry, right, okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, I think about appealing it, firstly, if you can. If not, then think about making a new request and getting evidence. Like I said, what you need to show is that your child may have special needs, and there may be a need for more provision than the school can provide. But yeah, obviously you want, in an ideal world, you want to be saying that the school have done X, Y, and Z, and now this is needed. There would potentially be scope for example, a discrimination claim against the school if they've not kind of done what they should be doing. I always think that's not necessarily a good option. You want to maintain a good relationship with the school, and it's not often the best way of doing that by bringing a claim against them. And also, in a discrimination claim against the school, the tribunal can kind of order things like an apology, and can order that they kind of maybe do things differently moving forwards, but those recommendations don't give you what a good EHCP that properly sets out what's needed does. So it's usually not the best way of sorting it. So I would say in that situation, just have a think about appealing, or if not, making another request, essentially. And also, if you think that school's bad, have a think about, often not the best, it's not something you want to do, but sometimes a practical solution might be to get a place at another school. And so do think about that and get it. Maybe a different school would have a different approach. It would be more helpful.
Thanks, James. We definitely are out of time. I think we've used up more than our allocated hour this evening, and apologies to those of you who have posted questions and we've not got to them this evening. I can promise you that we will respond to them in due course, and you will get some information about how we can follow that up. What I'd like to do before we kind of leave this evening is just a quick reminder that you will be sent a feedback questionnaire to fill in, and it's really important to us that we do get your feedback and comments so that we can plan future activities. Fantastic to see how the Facebook page is working, and please do join that if you feel it would be helpful to you and your needs. James, a final word from you at all?
Just that I hope it's helpful. I guess hopefully, like I said, what it does is kind of, I think if you understand the process, then you can spot a lot easier kind of when things are going wrong, and you do. It's not kind of local authorities are underfunded. That's no excuse. They still should be meeting their kind of legal obligations, but it shouldn't be like this. But you do often need to fight and just be encouraged by the fact that the tribunal's there. Kind of if you do that kind of look, parents will kind of see results. So yeah, don't be afraid to challenge things, because it's only by doing that you'll get what is needed. And if you've got an EHCP, check it, have a look through, check it, see if it does contain any specified provision, and try and get it sorted at the next annual review. If not.
Great advice as always, James. That's it. We're definitely out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Do visit the Owen Mitchell webpage for our ongoing updates in the coronavirus pandemic, but also with everything else that we've got going on nationally and regionally in your local areas. It's been a pleasure talking to you this evening. Have a good rest of the night. Take care.